Hello, everybody. This is Sarah Colada with Architecture Talk Tank. Today, I have an architect who runs his own practice, Antony DiMase. I'm really interested in the conversation we're going to have. I discovered Antony online, and I really love the way he speaks about his passions, his viewpoint onto architecture, as well as practice. So I think that we can have a sort of very interesting discussion about establishing your value proposition and how to really define what is it that you do for your clients. And I know that Antony nailed it in his description about his work. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Antony, thank you so much for accepting my invite to be a guest on this podcast.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
Wonderful. So perhaps we start with just learning a little bit more about you, Antony. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I guess where do we want to start? I mean, I'm based in Australia. I know that your audience is global. I run a practice in Fitzroy North, which is very close to the centre of Melbourne. Practice has been going for 20 years. It's a small practice. We mainly do residential education work and some commercial work. I got into architecture some time ago, and getting on, I was really inspired to do. I guess I became an architect. I wanted to run my architecture practice because I was a little bit frustrated working with other people. I don't know whether I was the best employee, to be honest with you, working for other people. I think I had just a real desire to do it for myself. And I knew that in some ways, whilst I didn't have highly, I wasn't great at any one specific skill, so to speak, I had a fairly good understanding about the broad nature of architecture, from concept design right through to completion, the management of the practice and all those sorts of things. So I had a fairly good understanding, in my view, of the overall structure of a practice. So I felt that sort of skill, if you like, was probably best suited to me running my own architecture practice rather than locking horns with whoever my director was at the time. So I was really always very comfortable with the idea of the practice being relatively small, I guess values-based, wanting to set very high standards for myself in terms of the service proposition that we could give to clients and the sort of way in which we delivered architecture to our clients, and trying to just set that bar as high as I possibly can, and sort of almost asking, and the people that we work with and the people that we have in our our consultants and so on and so forth, to really meet those standards that we set ourselves. And so in a way that became the sort of the benchmark for the way in which we run practice. It's something that you'd never really get right. I mean, it's a very complex thing, running an architecture practice. Anyone who says that it's not, I think, is kidding themselves. But I think what you need to do is improve the way in which you do the work on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a yearly basis, learn from your mistakes, and really just, like any endeavor in life, just set yourself the task of being better, with each time that you go about the work. So that's sort of been what I've strived to do. To the extent that we have been able to do it, I guess that's for other people to judge. I still feel like there's a lot more in the tank in terms of what we can do and what we can do, not what we can't do, but and that's really for us to explore and continue to do over the next 12, 18, 24 months.
I love that. I actually love how you started this. I feel so resonant with it because basically I had exactly the same story when I started to work for someone else in architecture. I started to feel like I'm an absolutely terrible employee. Like I can't take direction too well. And, it was like a struggle really to fit in. And at the beginning, I thought something's wrong with me, and I think that maybe it happens to some people that already have like an entrepreneurship spirit, but instead of pushing through past it and saying, okay, actually, this is a sign for me that I should start my own practice or go on my own. Sometimes they fear it and say, okay, maybe it's a sign for me I have to obey a bit more and and fit in more, and it's just such a shame to miss that opportunity to actually follow your own heart and say, you know what, actually this is a sign that I should do my own thing. How did you find that very moment? Like, were you very set on starting your own practice? You said that you felt fairly confident, but I'm sure that with all of those sort of turbulences and wherever you find yourself, maybe ill-fitting in the group or in the office, it's quite hard to push through and not have intensive emotions with it. So how was that experience specifically for you?
It was difficult. I mean, it coincided with the birth of our second child, Amelia. So we just took on a new home loan at the same time. So, a larger home loan because we had 2 children at that stage. And, it was sort of then or never if I was to, go out into practice. So I know that I was very nervous. I had done a lot of preparatory work. I'd been working I'd been doing private jobs whilst working for other architects. So the transition wasn't, one day I was working for someone and then the next day I was on my own. There was a sort of a period of transition, and I had prepared as best I could for the change. I was fortunate enough to have some colleagues who assisted me, who just provided some counselling or some guidance and professional advice, and I remained forever grateful to those people to this day. I think nothing really prepares you for the shock of not getting a paycheck. The idea that you have to sort of earn your fees and wrangle what the fee is and get paid, and then you pay a whole lot of other people first, and then you take your paycheck, and so on and so forth. Marketing, and as good as I was, perhaps as an employee, nothing really prepares you for that moment where you are out on your own. So I remember I worked very hard, as you sort of tend to do, and I actually became unwell in that sort of first 6 months. And I remember going to the doctor, and he said, you need a break. And I sort of wish at that point I was a little bit more responsive to my own needs, I suppose, that I didn't, I think if I was to counsel anyone who's listening to this podcast, who's thinking about running their own practice, is look after yourself, look after the relationships that you've got around you, look after your own mental health. All those things really, really count for a lot, because you will get there. I mean, ultimately, we provide a service to the community that is needed. Unless you're a really terrible architect, you're going to find a way to get jobs. You're going to find a way to develop your skill set. You're going to find a way of understanding the parameters of practice. So just being slightly more patient is valuable, and just working through it. So nothing prepared me for the shock, but my counsel to anyone who is listening to this podcast is just take care of yourself. Give yourself 12 months rather than trying to compress it into 6 months, and you are far better equipped if you're healthy and well through that initial phase.
That is so valuable, and thank you so much for sharing, because I think that still a lot of people are trying to push that experience and just focus on the good things that came after. And the great news is that actually eventually things do work, right? The business does take on, and you also learn to be a better business owner. But yeah, the beginnings are tough, especially when there's family and other people to be responsible for. But I think that you've given a great advice as to looking after yourself and not trying to achieve everything in a shorter period of time. So moving from that, tell me a little bit about how your idea of what the practice was developing and taking form as to where you finally arrive to the place where you realize that this is actually what we want to do and this is what we're about?
Well, I don't know whether we've arrived quite as succinctly as you might think, but there's always been a strong desire in me to inquire about what it all means, I suppose. And I ask a lot of questions of myself and of others. I think a sort of a turning point, and there are a number of turning points, but one that stands out is that sustainability has always been a really strong focus for me. I've always felt that good architecture and sustainability kind of go hand in hand. I think historically we can see that. You look at the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, you look at the work of a whole bunch of people historically, and there's always this connection between environment and architecture. There's always this inspiration between nature and architecture. And they might not have called it sustainability because there were different sort of parameters at that stage. They didn't know about sort of the climate emergency, but there's always been this strong connection between nature, the environment, and architecture. So to me, it kind of, the idea that architecture and sustainability are not good bedfellows was kind of crazy. We sort of lost our way through the sort of postmodernist era where I think technology came to the fore and we tended to think of buildings more like machines. But so I suppose the inquiry into sustainability has been something that's been really strong and foundational to the work. And I was at the stage, I was doing a lot of, I do a lot of renovations to existing houses, and we developed a skill set that enabled us to do renovations and adaptive reuse of buildings, configuring existing buildings, transforming existing buildings to some extent. And a friend said to me that, when I was sort of saying, how do we talk about sustainability in architecture? He sort of said, he made the point that we're really doing it through the creative reuse or through the adaptive reuse, through the renovation of existing buildings, that it was really kind of self-evident the way in which the work was sustainable. So that was a real turning point, because I started to think, well, in fact, I actually quite enjoy doing renovations to existing buildings. And rather than seeing it as a stepping stone to larger and bigger projects, I thought, well, actually, this is a kind of place that I'm quite comfortable with, and I can see it developing into its own little niche. That was particularly important. Another sort of turning point was, there was a big increase in, this is going back perhaps 10, 15 years ago, LED technology, lighting technology was coming to the fore. And if you think back 20 years ago, LED did not exist. And it's sort of hard to comprehend the transformation that LED technology has had on buildings, on lighting, and so on and so forth. And I through some friends that I had at the time who were in lighting, I became absolutely fascinated with lighting. And I became fascinated with artificial lighting or electric lighting, but then I also became aware of just the importance of daylight in architecture. And like while all this technology was being developed to such an incredible extent, I suddenly reverted back to the idea that actually daylight in architecture is one of the most foundational aspects of architecture. If you think of the Pantheon, or again, any great building, any great cathedral, any domestic great building, typically there is a real emphasis on light and lighting. And so I started to become fascinated with the way in which light, specifically daylight, and architecture work together. So I went off and did a master's of lighting to try and enhance that sort of skill set. And that became something that, I'm passionate with, I'm really passionate about to this day, because I find that you don't really, like you can just walk around and sort of enjoy the play of light on a building or play of light in space. In our own sort of environment on the desk that I'm looking at, there are shadows and things like that. So it became a really good way to engage with with people, because I haven't met a person who's not interested in light in some fashion. That doesn't mean they want an abundance of light. There are actually people who don't. So it just became something that I became interested in. So for me, sustainability and lighting became the key issues. Look, I could go on. There are other things that I could talk about, but they were sort of foundational. And I think along the journey, there have been these just moments where you kind of go, okay, this is kind of important, and this is something that I really value.
I love this. I love the fact that you actually decided to study it more. And did you find a way in which you were communicating that with your clients as you were developing more and more interest in lighting? Was that maybe through renders or photos or, I don't know, word?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's a funny thing. I did the lighting course, and I didn't, set out, I didn't, decide, oh, I'll offer a lighting service to my clients. I was more interested to develop my own skill set and communicate. So it really became a way of talking about architecture, sort of in a way. So it kind of sat below, in a way, the main. I mean, it's a very important aspect of the practice, but when you're talking to a client, the funny thing is you're still talking about, the functional aspects of the building, the regulatory environment. So a lot of the lighting aspects is kind of sits behind those conversations. So it's never a direct conversation with a client in truth. So, but if you actually look at the work, it's almost like it's a sneaky part of the practice, in that it invariably, what happens when the buildings are built is that most people respond to the lighting, or to the light, the play of light, is what I have found. It's certainly the thing that gives me the most, one of the most pleasurable aspects of the building. So it's like a bit of a sneaky part of the practice, in that it ultimately becomes the most important thing when the building is finished, but it's rarely spoken in explicit terms during the process. Having said that, we've done a podcast. We've done 6 podcasts in relation to architecture and lighting, which will be picked up again soon, because it's been in hiatus due to COVID. And it's just been a way of perhaps more engaging with other fellow professionals. And it's been a sort of personal interest of mine to sort of understand better. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, actually, I kind of wanted you to tell me a little bit more about the podcast, and I hope that you mentioned that. So, in fact, this is very interesting because, being a practice owner and sort of being interested in those topics that you're mentioning now, perhaps moving into a podcast and starting a podcast is not a very traditional thing to do. And yet you decided that would be a great modality to sort of open a place of conversation and connect with other people. And I personally find that very interesting. So why podcasting?
Well, I think it's probably the forum that suits me the best, to be honest with you. When I've written, I've tried to write, and I find it a bit cumbersome. I find sort of more interactive process better, the sort of this kind of conversational style better. So I think it suits me. I think, the key to good podcasts is good research. So just to give you a sense of what we did, we called it Light, Cities and Architecture. It was inspired by About Buildings and Cities, which is a very good podcast coming out of the UK. And we approached them and said, look, we wanted to do something similar, and they were comfortable with that. The future of the podcast is going to be a little bit different, in that we're going to talk about, we're going to interview people who are in the design field, but not necessarily architects. And we're going to talk about sustainability and this idea about decoupling, excuse me, decoupling the design process from consumption. Essentially, I've been very concerned that designers are part of the problem when it comes to the overconsumption of resources on the planet. So I think as designers, we have a role to play in trying to reduce the amount of consumption that we have in a building. And that can happen in a variety of ways, just thinking about how much space you need, how much waste is being used, how much energy the building is consuming, how many products get put into the building. So the focus of the podcast is going to shift slightly, and it's really around this idea that, which you'll find on my website, which is called Design More, Consume Less, which is that design should be really used as a catalyst for reducing the consumption of products and materials and energy, because I feel like we have a role to play in that. And if we're just attaching sort of green features on our building, then that's really not the way forward as far as I can tell. I mean, I'm happy for someone to tell me differently, but that's been my contention. So it's, design is a kind of funny thing. It's a really important role, plays an important role in society, but it can be misused for really damaging, can have a really damaging impact if it's not used right. I mean, there are puffer jackets which can buzz when you get a like on Instagram. There are kind of crazy things that people will design that have really no function other than, for you to consume, for you to purchase. And I think that's a real, we have an ethical responsibility to use design for good rather than evil, to put in simple terms. And I feel like the podcast is hopefully going to promote that idea. It's something that I'm really passionate about in terms of the practice as well. And it's sort of part of the reason why the practice, maybe it's also that I'm not a great business person, but it's also part of the reason that the practice has remained relatively small, because, I do think that there's a role to play in these sorts of discussions. I think, that we don't need a big building. We don't need a big house. We don't need another tall building. We've actually got way more buildings than we really need, as far as I can tell. And a lot of those buildings are in urgent need of repair, maintenance. That if we just did the basics on the buildings that we already have, we would go a long way to solving the environmental crisis that we're currently in. So, rather than building a new swanky 6, 7, 8-star building, it kind of makes sense that we do the hard work and actually deal with the stock that we've currently got.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So when you were actually thinking about all those reasons why you wanted to start a podcast, were you thinking specifically about the clients that will listen to it or other architects?
The funny thing is, I've tended to draw inspiration from non-architects. I mean, there's certainly architects that I admire. There are definitely architects that I admire, but I've always been curious about other things, whether it be philosophy, books around philosophy, and art and music. I mean, some of these, if you would ask me who I'm inspired by and I tell you someone that I'm inspired, it's kind of hard to draw the link between that person who I'm inspired with, and the way in which the architecture gets configured, to be really honest. So, if you ask me the question, name an artist that inspires you, and I tell you, I'll probably end up looking like a bit of a silly person. But the reality is I find inspiration in people who kind of carve out their own path in whatever creative endeavor they do. And I guess I'm drawn to those sort of people. I guess they're sort of slightly maverick, if you like, or I'm not sure what you would call them, but I'm interested in those sort of people that have a particular way of doing things. There are certainly architects. There's some architects in Italy, that Traverso Vighi, who I think do really outstanding work, who's, I just really, really admire the way that they've integrated lighting design, architecture, sustainability in with their work. They're just really outstanding architects in my view. It's an eclectic group of people that I'm inspired by, to be honest with you. I'm also really inspired by technology. I mean, like the iPhone, I think, like I talk about consumption, but I'll talk about the iPhone for a moment. In 2007, that was when it was first released. I still think of that moment when Steve Jobs presented the iPhone as really quite an amazing thing. The product itself, which we all are so familiar with, it's become, either most people have an iPhone, most people I know anyway, and the way that it sits in your hand, the way the functionality of it, the way that it is just a screen that can open up all these sorts of opportunities for learning and for knowledge is just an incredible thing. It's sort of the design aspects of the iPhone are pretty incredible, because it's as though the functionality, the way in which the user uses the iPhone has all been thought out, by someone, be it Steve Jobs and a whole lot of engineers who are working in the background, so that the user interface and the user experience is incredibly easy, and it opens up all of these possibilities. In a way, I draw that, if you can do architecture like that, I think that would be really amazing, where the architect actually thinks about all of the things that you are likely to do in a building, but does it so seamlessly that you're not even aware of the architecture, so that you can, in a sense, get on with your life and, enjoy the view to the outside, make a cake if that's what you want to do, listen to music. If all of that kind of happens seamlessly, so that you're not actually competing with the architecture, you're not actually sort of tripping over the architecture, or that the architecture is demanding your attention, then I think that's what good design really is. And certainly that's something that I really inspires me, or really, something that we work really hard to do. And again, if you go, it's a bit of a hard sell, because, if you look at the website, you sort of see some interior shots and whatever. They sort of seem quite simple and, almost like, well, that doesn't look too difficult. But in reality, to get to that sort of level of resolution is quite difficult. And what's really pleasing about the work is that when you go to some of these spaces that have been created, is that it's often the space itself and the light and the sort of the functionality of the space that really stands out to you. And certainly that's something that the clients have said to me. It's not the yellow feature wall or the chandelier that's hanging over the dining room. It's never any of those things that really become apparent in my work. It's really the spatial composition that is really, really important. And so if you were to talk about the inspiration, certainly it's something to do with the iPhone and other things that are kind of like that.
I love this. This is absolutely great. And, it's just incredible to think how much has changed basically with the design of an iPhone, because where we were before that, it was something that we've never went back to ever since. It was just this one design, changed completely the technology around phones. And in fact, we never went back into the keyboard or something like that. So, from the moment that was thought of, every single other designer thought of it to be so practical that we never really adopted or continued with any other technology that was before that. And that really was, super groundbreaking. And I love the fact of how you speak of the architecture not to get in the way of the user. It's super interesting. So what is like one example of how you achieve that, for example, through renovation?
Well, it's probably so the most recent building we've done a low energy building. So it's been certified as a low energy building by the Passive House Institute. which is quite an accomplishment for us. It's a building that is a freestanding building, so it's not a renovation. It's a new building, and the idea that we built a new building rather than renovated the building that was on site was something that we had to really grapple with for a long time with the clients. And we realized that building that was on site was at the end of its life, so we needed to build a new building. It's opposite a park, and essentially it's a really simple house. It's really it's designed for two people, and it's really it has a very simple palette, essentially white walls, timber, and then really the use of light, the play of light in the main spaces or in all of the spaces is really what's apparent. So it's hard to sort of describe it other than the experience of it is that it feels very easy to walk up to the front door, to go up the stairs to the main living room, to sit down and enjoy the view. It becomes something of a it's an experience that is very gratifying and very satisfying. It's as though you don't need anything else in the house. So the way in which the kitchen works, the way in which the bedrooms work, the bathrooms work, they all support that basic experience of entering the house, sitting down, enjoying the view, enjoying music, talking to your partner, and having family and friends over. That all becomes very, very apparent in the house through the experience. Now, lots of houses actually do this. The house that you live in, the house that I live in, pretty much does the same thing. I think what we try and do is simplify that architecture down to being quite essential to the space that we've created. So it becomes very easy to sort of just live your life within these spaces that we try and create. It's experiential rather than kind of driven by sort of features or knickknacks that sort of cloud the experience of actually being inside the space. So we could call it a minimalist aesthetic if you like, but it's more a curated sort of experience because we don't want to take away the identity of the clients that are occupying the space, but we want to create a sort of a version of architecture that allows the experience of space, view, light to be really apparent. So I think that building for me has sort of reached a sort of high watermark in terms of what we want to achieve in architecture, and we want to sort of take that and see how far we can go, how much better we can do with the next building and the building after that.
I love this, and yeah, it sounds like a great approach to design as well. Thank you so much, Anthony, for joining me on this podcast. It was an absolute pleasure listening to your journey and starting the business and then different passions and ideas that you implement into your designs. If people wanted to reach out or maybe go to your website, where do they find you online?
They're more than welcome to contact me if they wish, and they're more than welcome to visit the website. So the website is dimasearchitects.com.au. So that's DIMASE architects. They're welcome to send me an email if they wish, Antony@dimasearchitects.com.au. Look, I'm sort of very interested in, engaging with people. Often students have come to the office and we've had a chat. So I've never been one. We actually occupy a shop front here in Fitzroy North. So, our facade is on the street. We've often had people just drop in. I mean, it's not like I super encourage that, but if someone does walk through the door and ask me a question, we will deal with it. We try and be part of the community. So I'm not one that sort of closes the door off to other people. It's very much trying to engage with people as best I can. So look, I think what you're doing is fantastic. It's just a fairly simple thing that you're doing, and talking to architects and people in the design industry and opening up that conversation. I mean, it's a very worthy thing that you're doing, Sarah. So really congratulate you with what you're doing as well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you to all the listeners, and we'll see you all soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.